All right, guys, so welcome to our webinar. If you're a PPL holder who hasn't flown in a while, then hello, this seminar is really aimed to you. If you're a PPL student, maybe you're still studying, then there's going to be some good tips that you might pick up in this. We're doing a webinar in a couple of weeks based more at students and looking at how you can make up for the lost time that you've had in your sessions. But yeah, it's really aimed at PPL holders. My name's Finn, if you don't know already. I'm here with Dan and Harry. We're all instructors at Redhill Aviation. This is going to be Redhill focused, but if you're from elsewhere, welcome. I'm sure there's lots of stuff that will be relevant to you too. Before we get started, I love having some of these chats here in the chat box here. I'm going to ask you a few questions first. I want this to be quite interactive. We take some questions and answer some questions at the end. But I've got a few questions for you first. And can you just get involved in that chat box? Who here thinks there'll be a better pilot thanks to not having flown for 3-4 months, however long it's been? Let me know in the chat box what you think. If you think that's going to enhance your piloting skills, make you better, or do you think you'll be worse? Do you think you're going to be possibly a less safe pilot? Do you think you're going to be a little bit worse? Let me know in that chat box what you think. Me, Dan and Harry were talking about this earlier, and we think, and even we've been flying throughout this lockdown a little bit just to stay a bit current. But we were saying how, yeah, we were definitely feeling like we were going to be, our skills are going to be slightly faded and everything before we get back up in the air. Yeah, Brent, I love what Brent there said in the chat. Thanks, Brent. He said, nobody will be better. And I couldn't agree any more with you. No matter how good we are, if we don't do something for a long time, we get worse at it. And flying is exactly the same. So the aim of this seminar is to get you back in the skies safely, providing you some hints and tips of things you can do to keep yourself safe and confident, and so you can really enjoy being airborne again once we get back in the air. So for the next hour or so, me, Dan, and Harry, we're going to run through all the gotchas we could kind of think of, all the things that we think could catch you out, all the things that we think you and us should all be thinking about before we get back in the air. Some things you may already be doing or thinking about, in which case, great. And some things you may not be doing, in which case, if you come away with 1, 2, 3 tips or hints or things you're going to change or add to the way you go about your flying, then that's really, well, your time well spent and our mission accomplished. So a bit later, Dan's going to talk about some of the legal matters and common mistakes that we see with pilots that haven't flown in a while. Harry's going to talk about potential gotchas with airspace, NOTAM restrictions, and also potential gotchas with the aircraft itself that hasn't been flying for, or certainly hasn't been flying a lot recently either. And we'll spend about 15 minutes at the end answering some of your questions. But first, I want to talk about something a bit different that actually I think weaves its way through everything we're going to say today. Today, we're going to talk a little bit about capacity. So I think if you cast your mind back to when you were a PPL student, you could probably remember lessons where you were overwhelmed and had run out of capacity. And when that happens, you start thinking about what's going on properly. And you start making mistakes and you stop hearing things, and your body, your brain starts prioritizing things without you knowing. So you don't really know what your brain's prioritizing. And sometimes I see it described as a bit like a cup like this, where everyone has a sort of certain amount of capacity that they fill up with, you know, life matters. And then flying the aircraft itself takes quite a lot of effort and capacity from us. So that takes up a lot of our capacity. And then maybe there's extra distractions that we have, such as flying with a passenger, making sure they're not only having a good time, but their welfare and their safety is well looked after. Well, here's the thing. I think after this pandemic, this cup's going to look a little bit different, because no matter how much or little you've been affected by this pandemic, we are all going to have bigger stresses from home that we're bringing into this. And I think we really need to be aware of those extra stressors that we're bringing in, whether it be more concern about our jobs, our livelihood, or just our health and being obsessively washing our hands all the time now. We're all going to have these extra stresses that we're bringing in. We also said a second ago that we haven't done something in ages. We're going to be worse at it. It's going to take more of our brain power to do. So that's going to take up way more of our capacity to just fly the plane. And then I think as soon as you add extra distractions or things that you need to pay attention to, there's not really going to be much space in the cup or in your capacity. So everything we talk about today is looking at ways to reduce the capacity required, things you can revise, things you can do to give yourself more capacity and more space, and also how to maximize that spare capacity, what to do with it all, and how to prepare for that best. So I'm going to start off with really some of the things that we talked about already. We've all said on the chat, and lots of people are saying that, yeah, definitely they're going to be hedge funds. This is going to be rusty, no doubt. Loads of people saying, yeah, they're going to be rusty. Rachel, Phil, good to have you there in the chat. So look, I think we're all pretty happy that we're going to be a bit, our skills are going to have faded. I'm going to look at the main ones that will have faded. The memory, when you don't access something from your memory for a while, it gets harder to remember. Like if you haven't seen someone in a long, long time that you don't know very well, it's harder to remember their name just because you haven't accessed that bit of your brain, i.e. their name, for a while. So the same is going to be for the things we need to know in flying. So I'm suggesting way before you get anywhere near the aircraft, you sit down with that checklist and the POH and just revise your speeds, revise those checklists. Make sure that the first time you see that checklist isn't when you're sat in the aircraft. And don't forget to have a look over the emergency procedures as well. There's some things, if we're all honest, we probably gloss over more than we should. Also, radio calls. A lot of people have big anxieties about speaking on the radio, especially in your early days of flying. We see that all the time. I think Dan and Harry agree with me. That's something we hear a lot. So this is something you won't have done for a while as well. So I recommend, if you can, practicing those radio calls, say them out loud with a friend that also flies, or even just listening to the radio near your local airfield will just help you get used to that language again. Or alternatively, we're running a seminar in a couple of weeks' time. I'll go over the details in a bit, but you can come and we'll talk about how we master our radio calls and the little tips and tricks that you can do as well. Motor skills, another big thing, moving on from memory. Motor skills, if we haven't got used to using our hands and our eyes to coordinate and move stuff, they're going to be a bit rusty too. So we think slips are going to be more common. So it's more likely when you've reached that throttle, you might be reaching for that mixture instead. So be aware of that. And I think the trick to this is just to take your time, check that that lever and that button is correct. Don't be rushed. Give yourself more time. You're flying in general, then your coordination will need some practice as well. So consider practicing. And I'd say do this with an instructor, and certainly not in your first couple of flights solo. Go do it with an instructor. Practice some general handling. Dan's going to talk a bit more about the things you can do, but get some circuits in as well. Really make your first set of flights, not just the first flight, but the first few flights, beneficial to you to build your skills back up. But really don't rush into anything too challenging. I'm going to talk now quickly about maximizing your spare capacity because we haven't been in an aircraft for a long time. So there's lots of added stresses that weren't there before. We can have a lower tolerance. And actually, I found this after the last lockdown. I went up in my first flight. I just went and did some general handling, spun myself, did some big steep turns and some stalls. And I'm used to being thrown around in like aircraft. And all of a sudden, I felt that I had a lower tolerance to G-force and turbulence and being thrown around a bit. So really be aware of that, that's going to minimize your spare capacity. You're not going to have been in a loud environment like that for a long time. We'll have all been in our nice, peaceful, calm houses that aren't too hot or too cold. All these things that general aviation aircraft can add to our stress. So really, I think maximize your spare capacity by first flight. Go up with an instructor first. Don't overwhelm yourself. Have a safety, have a sort of safety net there of an instructor. When you do go up solo, I recommend you make that first flight simple. Don't do anything too ambitious. Keep it short. Go up for 30, 40 minutes. Give yourself loads of time to do a nice short flight just to get back into the air. I recommend not taking any passengers for the first few. I'd probably even recommend not even taking other licensed pilots, and just make sure that you are able to handle the aircraft on your own and you don't have any distractions. And then on a day with good weather, don't go up in marginal conditions in the early days. In fact, not at all ideally, but don't take yourself up there. Don't make your first flight a flight into sort of 5-6 kilometers visibility, even if it is legal. And then if possible, there have been some real peak weekends and days with opening and closing of lockdowns. And a couple I've witnessed have just been very, very, very intense. So I really recommend just ignore that first weekend that GA's opened up. And really, I think if you spend twice as long as you would normally and twice as long as you want to prepare for this, all of this is going to go absolutely fine. So don't forget to enjoy it. That's the real thing for me. Look, I've spoken enough about this. I'm going to pass over to Dan now, who's going to get into some more specifics about this and about what maybe you may have missed.
Hi everyone, my name's Dan. It's fantastic to see some of you in the chat box that I've flown with before. If I haven't, my name's Dan, and I'm just going to have a little bit of a chat now about making sure you're current and legal to fly after such a long period of time, potentially of not flying. So we're going to start off just by looking at currency and legal requirements. And the first thing obviously you're going to want to check is your license, that little blue book that you haven't got out of your flying bag, maybe in months. You've got to have a little look inside of that and just check that everything is still current. And also, you know, the limits of the license that you've got. So with your license, first of all, you want to check your SEP expiry date. So your single engine piston has an expiry after 2 years. So you're going to want to make sure that firstly, you've got that in date. And secondly, if it is starting to look like it's going to expire, then what do you need to do about that? If you do have an IR or IMC rating, again, making sure that you check the expiry of those. And really important, know your license limits. So if you've got an SEP, if you've got an IR, IMC, night rating, know what that allows you to do, the privileges of that rating and the limitations of that as well. Really big one, a lot of people gloss over it. Actually, when you receive your license, you need to make sure that on the signature of holder line, you've signed it. Technically, your license isn't actually valid if you haven't signed it. So that's a really worthwhile thing to check. Make sure you've actually signed your license. As I said, on the license, you'll see a nice big table, probably with lots of empty boxes, but maybe with some filled in as well. And the important thing to look at is obviously the valid until column. So you want to make sure that everything that you've got or everything that you had before the lockdown is still current, and start thinking about what you need to do if some of those are expiring. Next thing you're going to want to look at is your medical. Again, you want to make sure that it's the correct type for the aircraft you're flying. So for most of you, you'll have a Class 2 medical. If you're flying on LAPL privileges, you might have a medical declaration, but you need to make sure that that is current. You're also going to check the expiry date and also make sure that's signed as well. Again, not current unless you are signing these documents. And again, there's a table breaking down the individual elements of your medical and which expires on what day. Next thing you're going to want to have a look at is the chart. Now, it's something that's probably been folded or scrunched away in your bag for months and months, and it's probably got old roots on it. It's probably got wind arrows from about 7 months ago on it. And so there's a few things you're going to want to do before you go flying with relation to your chart. First of all, and this is really important, you've got to make sure that it's in date. It's a legal requirement that you carry an in-date chart with you. And so you need to unfold it, unfortunately, and check the date on the chart. Now, for those of you that aren't aware, you do need to get a current chart every year. So some of you that haven't flown in a very long time might actually have the 2019 chart. So that's something you need to be aware of. And for those of you that got the 2021, unfortunately, that's going to expire and the new chart is going to be coming out on the 25th of March. So you need to make sure that you either pre-order that or buy it in the club next time you come in. It's really important, clear off any old markings. As I said, you might have wind arrows, you might have routes, you might have little notes to yourself on your chart. So you're going to want to make sure that it's nice and clean, just so that when you get your chart out in the aircraft, as Finn said, you know, your capacity is going to be stretched as it is. You want to make sure that you're not seeing irrelevant information that might distract you. Really useful tip. If you bought your chart maybe online or from another club, it might be centered around a different airfield. So you're going to want to make sure that it's nicely folded. If you're flying from Redhill, make sure that the first thing you see in the middle of the folded page is Redhill. And obviously, if you're planning to go out to the east, you're going to make sure it's easy to access that part of the chart. The last thing you want to do in the flight is start unfolding your map and trying to center it while you're flying, because that's not going to end up too well. So folded correctly. And Harry's going to have a little bit of a chat later on about Sky Demon, but just in terms of current and legal to fly, if you are using Sky Demon or any sort of moving map software, make sure that it's updated and everything's current on it. Because I guarantee you, if you haven't used that app since even December, things are going to be outdated on there. Finally, I want to talk about your kneeboard. So whether you choose to have something strapped to your leg, whether you just have a clipboard, whether you have a notepad, whatever you choose or whatever you found comfortable flying with, there's some considerations that's worth making about the kneeboard or whatever you choose. So the first thing as a top tip really is to have a list of frequencies on there. Firstly, if you are feeling a little bit stretched for capacity in the aircraft and you've got to change frequency, it's really easy if it's just written down that you can, change the frequency, and you can think about the next frequency you're going to use as well. So you've got a list of those that make your life easier in the airplane. Same with nav aids if you are trying to track a VOR, for example. Having the nav aid and the Morse ident on there will really help you out with that. Current ground chart, something that could quite easily be forgotten. You should head on to the AOP website and just print out a ground chart for wherever you're flying from. If it's Redhill, Fairix, Blackbush, wherever, have a A5 or an A4 sheet of paper with the ground chart on there, so that when you get that first taxi clearance, you know where the holding point is, you know the orientation of the runways, you know which route to expect in a taxi clearance. Or if you've just landed somewhere that you've not been before, having that ground chart, you know where to vacate the runway, where to go for parking, where to go for fuel. So it's really useful to have those printouts on the kneeboard, easy and accessible. And then anything else you find useful, think about in flight, what actually would be useful for you to have as a quick reference, maybe some speeds. Maybe the departure and arrival procedures for Redhill, for example. If you're looking to do some instrument flying, Morse code, if you're listening to the ident for a VOR, it's unless you know Morse code, you're going to need the ident written down, or at least the Morse code table there to reference. And finally, interception procedures in the bag that you take flying. It's a legal requirement. It's probably buried in the back somewhere. So as a handout for yourself, just in case it did happen, would be useful. So next I'm going to talk about the limits of your license. So for most of you, you will have a single engine piston rating on your PPL. As I said, you're going to want to make sure that that's current. And if it is coming towards the end of its date, then you're going to need to look at revalidating that. And there's a number of ways of doing it. So I'd recommend if the date is coming or fast approaching on your SEP expiry, head on to the CAA website under single engine piston rating. It gives you the breakdown of how you can revalidate that. But very simply, you can either have a flight test up to 3 months before the expiry date, and that will preserve the date, or you can revalidate by experience. So there's all sorts of information on the CAA website. And if you've got any questions, feel free to fire them at the end of the webinar. Next thing is if you're carrying passengers. Now, as Finn said, it's probably not a good idea on your first flight after months off to take your whole family flying. However, at some point, you are going to want to take friends and family, enjoy the experience with them. So you need to make sure that actually you're allowed to do that. And so you've got to ensure that you've got 3 takeoffs and landings as the pilot in command in the preceding 90 days. If you don't have that, then you'll have to take the aircraft up either with an instructor or solo and do 3 takeoffs and landings to fulfill that requirement to take passengers. One of you in the comments mentioned about night rating, so I'm just going to very quickly talk about that. It allows you to fly VFR at night if you did want to go and do some sightseeing at night. If you get a night rating, it doesn't have an expiry date, so when you're checking on your license, you won't see a date associated with that. However, as with the day requirement, if you want to take passengers, 3 takeoffs and landings, this time 1 of which has to be at night in the preceding 90 days in order to take passengers with you. James and Finn's going to talk a little bit at the end about COVID travel restrictions. Put simply, if you're going to go on a nav flight, make sure you're actually allowed to go where you're planning to go. If you're thinking about going to the Channel Islands, if you're thinking about going even to Wales, Scotland, each country at the moment has their own requirements for travel, and you've got to make sure you fulfill those. The dreaded B word, Brexit. I'm just going to have a quick chat about the EU exit and what that might mean for some of your licenses, because it's really important that you know, again, the limits of your license and also what this might mean for you. So in the first instance, some of you may have an EASA issued license. If you have an EASA license issued by a national authority that's still in EASA, you need to carry what's called a certificate of validation as part of your license. And basically, that's just a printout, an A4 sheet you get off the CAA website, and that permits you to fly a G-registered aeroplane, and that's valid until the end of next year. After that point, you'd need to get a UK FCL license in order to continue flying an a G-Reg aircraft. For most of you, I'm sure this is the most relevant. If you have a UK FCL license. So this is where you had a UK issued EASA license. After the end of last year, that just became a UK FCL license. Unfortunately, you're no longer able to fly EASA registered aircraft. There is an exception. You can get license validation from the national authority within EASA, but the actual license itself no longer allows you to fly a EASA registered aeroplane. Really importantly, if you're now looking for any sort of rule and regulation, whether that's Part FCL, if you want to check about what your license is allowed, you need to now go through the CAA website and not the EASA website. Basically, when we left EASA, we copy and pasted all the regulations, but as time moves on, they're going to start diverging away. And so if you're checking the EASA regulation, that might not necessarily be the UK regulation as the year progresses. Finally, if you have any questions or queries, either ask us at the end, or there's a dedicated Brexit microsite on the CAA website. I'll pop the link to that in the chat as well. So I'm now going to pass over to Harry. He's going to have a little bit of a chat about what it means for you to go back to flying and the sort of things that you're going to be checking before you go fly.
Thanks, Dan, and thank you, Finn, as well. Guys, there's been some really great points highlighted here today. If you like what you're seeing here, if you like the content that we're putting out, then give us some feedback. Tell us what you like. Maybe tell us what you'd like to see some more of as well in the future going forward. There's plenty of options of things that we can talk about in further seminars in the longer term. But equally, if any questions crop up, just let us know in the chat box and we'll do our best to answer them at the end. So thanks for joining us. I'm going to talk a little bit now, about your pre-flight prep as we look to strap ourselves to a Cessna and take to the skies again in just a few weeks' time. So in this section here, we're just going to talk about a few items that you can do in advance of your first flight back to get yourself feeling comfortable and confident about your return. The weather is the first item on the agenda, then NOTAMs. We'll talk a little bit about route preparation and some of the aircraft checks, and finally a little note on passenger briefings. So we'll start with the weather because, well, it's the most obvious place to start, right? If the weather is no good, you're not going to go flying. You're not even going to consider looking at the NOTAMs or planning a route. So just as a little way to dust off the cobwebs, it's been a while. Make sure you know where you can access all of your briefing materials. The official source is the Met Office website. Key charts that are useful are the surface pressure charts, the Form 214 and 215 charts for significant weather and winds. An often overlooked tool as well is the GA Met chart. This is a textualized aviation-based forecast that is put out through the Met Office website, and it makes for a little bit easier reading than some of the other stuff up there. Any significant weather will be published in a SIGMET. And there's an example of an F215 there. So here at Redhill, we have an ATIS, and you can actually access that through the Redhill Aerodrome website. I don't know if you knew that already. It's a really useful tool, and you'll obviously check it as well when you are started up on the ground at Redhill and tuned into the frequency. Keynote on that, Dan's already highlighted this, but make sure you've got all the frequencies written out. So any ATIS frequencies you need, have them pre-noted on a bit of paper on your Kneeboard. Also be sure to check the TAFs and METARs for any of the airfields that you're flying from or to, or even passing in the vicinity of, just to help build up your overall picture of what the weather's doing on the day. I've got to be honest, I'm quite an advocate for Windy. It's a really useful tool. Those of you that haven't used it before, it's free, it's accessible online. It gives you a useful weather radar, which you can use to supplement your official Met Office sources of weather info. You can pin on a location here, and it gives you increased awareness of the overall weather picture. Also consider the sunrise and sunset tables. Remember, these are accessible in the AIP Part Gen. This is really important if you're considering going flying early in the morning or late in the evening. The key thing running through anything to do with self-briefing on the weather: identify any threats that are relevant for you on the day. So have you considered the fronts? Have you considered if there are any wind limits that are applicable on your aircraft type, for example, crosswind limit on takeoff and landing? Do you remember what this was? If not, do you remember where to find it? Have a little comment if see if how many of you can remember where to find that one in the is it, well, you tell me. Put it in the chat box below and we'll see who's got that one right. Weather, general terms, things like thunderstorms, they can bring also reduced visibility, icing. So make sure that you're keeping tabs on what the weather's doing and also the trends. Cloud base is obviously relevant, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that now. So winds, crosswind limits is in the aircraft POH. If anything that you're unsure about when it comes to the aircraft, then obviously check it. But if you can't find it, come and consult an instructor. So talking a little bit about the cloud base then and VMC. At Redhill, we have specific minima relevant for all of our VFR only pilots. So unless you've got an instrument rating or an IMC, then this is what you will need to be adhering to operating out of Redhill. And that is a 5 kilometer visibility and or a ceiling of 1,500 feet. And remember, that is above ground level, okay? The Redhill special VFR minima is published, and that is 3 kilometer visibility and or a ceiling of 700 feet. Now, just have a think about this. Those of you that have operated out of Redhill, if you're coming in from South Godstone Station and you're looking towards Redhill, that is around about 3 kilometers. It's certainly no more than that. So imagine yourself down now, trying to stay below a cloud base or ceiling rather of 700 feet, and you can only just about see the airfield from South Godstone. This is why we're really trying to drill home the message of pick a good weather day for when you go flying, when you go back. You know, Finn's spoken about capacity, and it's just going to make things so much easier for you. In terms of outside of Redhill, we are still using the standardized European rules of the air VFR minima in the UK now that we've left the EU and the EASTA system. But can you actually remember what these are? Well, here we go. Hopefully this is helpful for you. Remember, some of these airspace categories we don't actually have within the UK here, but this chart provides quite a useful picture, and I suggest that you refamiliarize yourself with any areas on here that are a little bit covered in cobwebs since we last flew. The key message here, guys, is give yourself less workload overall. So just because you can legally go flying on the day, think about your own personal minima. Okay, use a little bit of airmanship, and remember that good weather brings out more out of practice pilots, and there'll be a hell of a lot of them. So the key point here, look out at all times. From the 21st of May in the UK, there is a change coming that I would like to highlight. Now, if you look into the Class D airspace on the Sierra graph just above there, you can see that we currently require 5 kilometers visibility and a vertical and horizontal separation of cloud of 1,000 foot and 1,500 meters respectively. From the 21st of May, that changes, okay? VMC will now become 5 kilometers visibility, so the same as it was before, but now it will be clear of cloud and the surface in sight at all times. So that will only apply during the day and to an airspeed of 140 knots or less. And from the 21st of May. So when you're going back flying from the 12th of April, which is when we are hoping to reopen, exciting, hey? Then this will not apply for another month and a bit beyond that point. So you've self-briefed on the weather, and it's been a while since you've looked at NOTAMs. Just before you dive into the NOTAMs, remember it's always worthwhile just having a little bit of a flick through of the AIP, any other areas that might be relevant for you that you've not thought about in a while. You know, have you really considered what would happen in the event of a comms failure in VMC? Have you thought about some of the key content in AICs that's relevant? And if not, have a little look, okay? There's some out there, for example, on performance factors for takeoff and landing, and this is all going to become very relevant when you get back towards preparing for your first flight back. Now, NATS, the AIS website, is the official source for all of your AIP, AICs, and NOTAM information. However, that being said, I am another huge advocate for another electronic form, and that is through the Sky Demon service. This allows you to see all of your NOTAMs in a printed map format, so it shows it where it is on the ground. You don't have to try and plot things out and visualize it. It's very clear, very easy to use, and I highly recommend it. If you don't have access to Sky Demon, which you have to pay for, then there's a free service available called NOTAM Info. Again, this is quite useful for self-briefing on the ground before you go flying. This can all be done at home, even before you get to the airfield. And that's what we're asking you to do at Redhill. We'll speak a bit more about this later on, but NOTAM Info, useful tool there as well. The key point though is just make sure that you do reference the official source, which is the AIS. Things to look out for, potential gotchas when we go back flying are restricted airspace. There was quite a bit over the English Channel just prior to Christmas. And there was another one as well. We tend to use a lot of the Buell Water area operating out of Redhill, and they tend to have some restricted airspace over the winter period with their light show. So have a good look to see any pop-ups, then they'll all be published on NOTAM. Bear in mind, there could be ATC units closed. So some airfields will not have the means to implement social distancing, and so they won't be reopening from the 12th of April. Some of them might not be reopening ever again, but the only way really you can self-brief here is to make sure that you've checked the NOTAMs. A key point as well, if the airfield is closed, then that will obviously be flagged up there, but there might be specific requirements if they are open that they didn't have in place before COVID. So make sure you gain prior permission, which is the PPR, call them up in advance and ask if they've got any specific COVID social distancing requirements in place. And also be aware of any frequency changes. Things might look a little bit different since you last flew. It's always quite handy to carry a frequency reference card. Dan mentioned about this to put on your Kneeboard. That's a useful one to have. Great, so you've briefed on the weather, you've checked the NOTAMs, and now we're thinking about where we're going to go flying on the first few flights back. Refresh your memory of the local controlled airspace around us. So Farnborough has had a huge number of changes to controlled airspace over the past year or so. So I strongly recommend that you have a look at that. We're also quite close to Biggin Hill. We're extremely close to Gatwick, and we're just tucked under the London TMA. So these are all hotspots for infringement, and we're going to cover this in a lot more information in our next webinar. So that's next week, guys. Make sure that you set a little reminder to tune in for that one. Consider when you're planning your route, the terrain. Think about your safety altitude, the proximity to the controlled airspace. If you're off to somewhere like Headcorn and you need to make sure you're aware of parachute dropping, there might be other sites en route of glider traffic or hang gliders. But initially, really, it's best to just create a simple route to build your confidence back up again, and don't try to overcomplicate things unnecessarily. Also consider the take two principle. We use this at Redhill. A lot of our students will be familiar with this. So take two is where you give yourself 200-foot separation from a controlled airspace boundary, or 2 miles laterally. This is a really useful tool. The CAA has been pushing this for a while, but what we're saying here is for your first few flights back, actually think about maybe even doubling it, because you're going to need that bit of extra capacity until you've got back into the swing of things. So it's a handy little tip. If you're planning a nav, I again strongly recommend Sky Demon, but that being said, the best thing you can do here is actually to, and you're not going to like this, but it's to manually plot it. Get your chart out, get your plug out, get your pens out, and get down to the nitty-gritty plotting. So draw your halfway lines, draw your fan lines, calculate your headings, ground speeds and times. And the reason I say this is because it's going to really get you thinking about what's happening along that route, the corrections you're making to the headings, and also threats that appear along that route. So you're going to be thinking a lot more about the route if you actually plot it out. That being said, though, I do recommend that you take the Sky Demon along. The CAA have said many a time that if you fly with a moving map alongside you, it significantly reduces the chance of an infringement. So really can't recommend it enough. Another useful tip here, write some prompts on your chart. If you're in the cruise leg, you've not done that in maybe a year. So put a little blob on your route track line and just say ATIS or FRIDA at appropriate points, or whatever it may be, a little check, climb, descend, you know, and that will just give you get you triggered, ready to take that action and make sure that you don't miss it. So this is quite a useful one to use. And just on Sky Demon as well, if you are using it, before you go flying, before you even go to the airfield, make sure you've downloaded it. Dan's touched on this already, but it's no good downloading it on the way to the airfield and then getting there, figuring out that the whole interface has changed and that the charts are all out of date. So get it prepared beforehand. Prior preparation and planning prevents poor performance. And then on the day, you can use it as a supplement to your nav that you've already planned. But ultimately, guys, look out, okay? Traffic separation is down to you. Key point, don't let the aircraft take you anywhere your brain hasn't already been. That's really, really the emphasis behind this whole briefing today, isn't it? Okay, so now you've figured out where you're going to go, and you've got to the airfield, and you've picked up the keys, and now you're going to check the documents. So here we are. We've got a copy of a CRS, Certificate of Release to Service. Now, be aware that a lot of these aircraft haven't flown in a while. They have flown throughout the lockdown, but not as regularly as they normally would. So one key thing on the CRS to check is not just the date of the expiry, but also is not just the hours of the expiry, sorry, but the date also. Okay, make sure both criteria haven't been met. There are also a whole host of other documents for the aircraft, which you know about. Make sure that they are all there and present and in date. Also, make sure you've done your mass and balance and performance calculations. It's probably been a fair while since you've had to do this. So just have a little practice now. Get back into the swing of it. Maybe you're a little bit unsure. You don't want to find out the night before at 8 o'clock in the evening, before you're due to go flying the next day, that you can't remember the takeoff calculations. So any doubts, just get in touch with an instructor and we'll be more than happy to help. But if there's a lot of you that want to see more on this, as I've said, let us know, guys, in the chat box. We might be able to do some more mass and balance type webinars going forwards, or if there's anything else that's relevant for your own development that you maybe want to see a bit more of, let us know and we'll see what we can do. So now you're going out to do your walk around, the A check. A key point here with this one, guys, take the checklist with you. Okay, do your checks walking around the aircraft, checklist in hand. You've not done it in so long, the chances are you're going to miss something otherwise. So hold that with you. Go around the aircraft and have a good look out for anything that might look like this. Okay, hopefully we won't see any of this at Redhill, but wildlife love stationary aircraft. When I was at a previous club, we had a hedgehog that managed to get itself nested on board the aircraft. So these things can happen. It's not what you want to, not what you expect, and not what you want to find, certainly. But if you do a thorough walk around, then you will spot this in advance. Have a good look as well for corrosion, particularly under the wings, any leaks around fuel drains, etc. Any hydraulic fluids. Be aware of the undercarriage being sufficiently inflated, the brake condition as well, and have a good thorough check of all the flying controls, in addition to all the checks that you know how to normally complete. Also, the aircraft have been sat in quite damp, humid weather over the winter. If there's anything that you see that doesn't quite look right, come and get an instructor or let the ops staff know. James or Reese will be more than happy to help alongside us. Okay, we're also parking on the grass at Redhill, and any of you that have been out walking, doing your COVID daily exercise, will have noticed that the ground is really soft at the moment. The aircraft have sort of sunk in a little bit, so you might find in the first few flights that you try to go flying after you've been with an instructor, so now you're solo, that you might need a bit of a push to get yourself moving. So come and get an instructor and let them know that you're going flying, and we'll help you out. Okay, the aircraft are parked quite close together, so when taxiing forward, taxi at a slow walking pace. If you have space, then cross to the tarmac at 45 degrees with the controls fully back, nice and slow. And once you're on the tarmac, check to the wingtips either side as well, ensuring that you've got clearance from the parked aircraft either side of you. Now, when you're taxiing out or back in at Redhill, you might find that you have to turn on the taxiway. Okay, now this is something that can be a little bit tricky to do, but it can be done in all our aircraft, even on the narrow taxiways at Redhill. If you're unsure at any point, then just stop, put the brakes on, shut the aircraft down, get out, and you can turn it right round by hand if needed. Okay, but the key point here, if you go onto the grass and we're on hard ops only, and you get stuck, don't try and power out with power, because the aircraft will just bed in. Okay, instead you put the brakes on, you shut down, and you move it by hand. If you can't move it by hand, then you come and get an instructor. Okay, great. Coming back in as well in terms of parking, if you can't park it, if you don't feel confident parking it, again, just park up on the tarmac. We're not using the grass until they say so on the aerodrome website. And that's somewhere you can visit redhillaerodrome.co.uk, and they give a detailed info on which runways and surfaces we're using. Don't go on the grass unless it's been authorised, and if you do, then what we'll do is you park on the tarmac and you turn it round and push it back on the grass with the help of an instructor. Great. So back to the walk around then. We've been talking a little bit there about parking as well, but back to the walk around. Fuel. The aircraft have been sat for quite a while with a bit of water possibly contaminating in the tanks. So do a visual check. You can see this picture here of avgas floating on a huge wad of water. We don't want to see anything like that. Check all the tank drains. The CAA have suggested that there's a shelf life of 3 months for avgas. This shouldn't be a problem at Redhill because we will be refueling the aircraft, and that will ensure sufficient mixing. It's critical that you depart with sufficient fuel. So come to the airfield with a fuel plan already drawn out. Have you considered your trip fuel? Have you considered contingencies? And think about your reserves, okay? If you're in any doubt, come and speak to an instructor before you go flying. And finally, Dan's mentioned already about your currency requirements for carrying passengers, and Finn's spoken about the extra demands this will place on you for capacity. But a key thing that I will add is the passenger brief. Some people get a little bit flustered when they've not done a passenger brief in a while. So here's a really useful one you can download from the Redhill Aviation website in the download section. Carry it with you on your kneeboard, and you don't need to worry. But I do suggest look at it beforehand, have a little bit of a practice, and get familiar with it. Final point is regards to the tech log. Just make sure it's properly filled out before and after you go flying. And if you are taking passengers, ensure that you list their name on the tech log also. So thank you. And there will be a little bit more further information provided at the end of the PowerPoint for a bit more reading. The CAA have produced these 2 documents, which are quite worthwhile having a look at, and the Skyway Code version 3 is there also. So I'm now going to hand back to Dan, who's going to talk a little bit about threat and error management. And any questions, guys, that you've had on this section, as I've said, please give us some feedback and fire away in the comments. Cheers.
Hi everyone. So it's really important that you do ask the questions. If you've got any thing that's sort of burning as you've been watching this webinar, please do put them in the comments. We're reading through them at the moment. We'll answer as many as we can at the end, and obviously just anything you've got at all, put it in the comments box and we'll try and answer that. So I want to talk now about threat and error management. It's something that can be firstly very overlooked, and secondly it can be part of you consider it irrelevant almost sometimes, and it's very easy to forget, and it isn't. It's so important, even when you're going flying on your own, when you're going flying with passengers, if you're in a light aircraft, all the way up to a commercial jet. Threat and error management is really, really important to everyone in aviation, so it's worth mentioning in this webinar. So threat and error management is a model, and it's based around threats and errors, so it's probably worth mentioning what those are. So threats and errors, any combination of a threat and or an error can lead to what's called an undesired aircraft state. And an undesired aircraft state is, as the title assumes, something that we don't want to do in the first place. So the difference between a threat and an error: the threat is outside of our control. It could be any number of things, and we'll talk about those in a moment. And an error is very much something that we've done which is incorrect. So it's leading to a deviation from the organised, and it's something that we've done as a flight crew. Examples of errors: you could have poor aircraft handling, if you set the incorrect QNH, or even before you go flying, if you have an error in your mass and balance, that could lead to an error in the airplane as well. So threat and error management is really important to consider. And so what I want to do now is open it up to you guys in the comments section. And I just want to gauge what you think are the biggest threats to your flying when the club reopens. So your first flight back, maybe after months and months of not flying. What are the most prevalent threats that you can think of that are going to affect your flying when you go back? So pop it in the comments section, and then we'll go through some of those. Hopefully some of you will come up with ones that I haven't even thought of, and we'll discuss those. Whilst you guys comment, I'm just going to go through a couple of them now. So obviously for some of you it's going to have been a very long time since your last flight, so that in itself is a threat, and that's going to have a knock-on effect as well. So your degraded flying skills, as Finn's mentioned, if you don't practice something, it's going to become worse and worse. And so even if you jump in an airplane, it's not going to be the same standard as it used to be. So mitigation against threats. So for every threat that we identify, we want to identify mitigation against it in order to prevent that threat from becoming an issue. So a check flight before your first solo is a requirement at Redhill, but some places may not require it, but it's a really, really useful tool for you as PPL holders to come in with an instructor and just focus on getting those flying skills back to where they used to be. As Finn said, take it slowly, avoid unnecessary risks, make sure you're thinking about actions before you do them. Finn mentioned, it's so easy if you're consumed by other things and your capacity bucket is full. You could so easily, reach for the mixture instead of the throttle. And so you would avoid that really easily just by slowing down, thinking about what you're doing, and then doing it. Another really important thing to think about is what are you going to do in case of emergencies, an engine failure or a stall. It's really easy just to think about the case of events in a normal flight, takeoff, cruise, and maybe a bit of general handling. But you've got to think about from that very first flight, what are you going to do in case of an emergency? Because you haven't flown in a long time, the aircraft's not going to take pity on you. It doesn't mean that nothing bad could happen. You've got to think about what you're going to do if something does. So top tip really is once you've taken off on your first flight, maybe you're settling down at an altitude, you're thinking now about, okay, maybe I've got a little bit of spare time. Think about, what am I going to do in case of an engine failure now? Where would I go? What actions do I need to take? And thinking about those things, even, in a couple of minutes, really puts you in a good position in case it did ever happen to you. As Finn mentioned, memory items and speeds. So it's no good, not thinking about it, getting in the aeroplane, trying to take off, and then not even remembering your climb speed. You've got to have that speed in your mind so that you can instinctively fly the airplane correctly when you go back. So spend a little bit of time revising the speeds and the emergency items. You know, if you need to, have a little printout on your Kneeboard just so you can glance down if you do forget on those first few flights. But it's all about making sure that you come really well prepared for those flights. As with anything, you know, any questions, ask an instructor. If you're on your check flight, or maybe even you're going to take an aeroplane out on your own, in the club, before you even go, you know, grab an instructor, anyone's going to be happy to answer that for you. Linking back to what Finn said, obviously your motor skills, you haven't practiced these for a while, and so it's not going to be to the standard it used to. Slips are more common, and general coordination is going to require more practice. So I'm just looking through the comments now. Some really good suggestions. We've got busy skies. Yeah, absolutely, Brent. Very busy airspace, out of practice pilots. Well, I think I've just run through the out of practice pilots. Busy airspace, I'm definitely going to cover in a second. That's really important to think about. Well done. Yeah, absolutely. You know, you guys watching this webinar are the proactive pilots out there in the community. So it's fantastic that you're thinking about these things, but it doesn't necessarily mean that everyone else is thinking about these things. So yeah, absolutely. Weekend warriors. Threats of rough running engine because they haven't been flown. Well, that brings me really nicely onto this point. Thanks, Ed. Yeah, aircraft haven't been flown as frequently as they used to. You know, we've been taking them up for maintenance flights. As Harry said, you know, the aircraft are used to be running all the time, and now they're not. So the mitigation against that threat, thorough A check and a walk around, as Harry said. Check the aircraft documents, check the tech log. You know, if you're taking an airplane out for self-hire, you're the PIC, so you are responsible for making sure that the aircraft is legal. So you need to check the aircraft documents before you go flying. And as with everything, if you're unsure, ask somebody. Capacity issues. So something Finn mentioned earlier on, you're not going to be able to take in as much as you used to. So really top tips here, plan ahead. Give yourself plenty of time. You know, if you're coming in after your flight towards Redhill and everything's happening too quickly, you've got to get the ATIS, you've got to get your clearance, you've got to plan your arrival back in, everything's happening too quickly for you, consider things that will help you out. You know, the slow safe cruise, slow the airplane down, it gives you more time to do everything else. The planning doesn't have to be in the air. Most of the planning for your flight should happen on the ground. So as it's been mentioned earlier on, you know, spend twice as long on that first flight on the ground planning it. Make sure that you know what you're going to do and that you're adequately confident for the flight. Top tip for you, have pen and paper ready. So if you've got a Kneeboard, just have a scrap of paper, have your pen, any ATIS, any clearance, anything at all, write it down. It will stop you getting that bit more stressed and stop that capacity bucket filling up even more in the aeroplane. If you get a clearance, jot it down in whatever freehand you've got. And if you forget it when you're given the readback, you could just glance down and it's there. You know, it's not the end of the world if you have to repeat a clearance from ATC. But I think for most people, it adds a little bit more stress. You know, you start getting a little bit flustered and potentially you might neglect other things because you're so focused on that radio call. So pen and paper ready is a really good tip for you. Mass and balance, something that needs to be done before every flight, but something that actually can be neglected, especially if you haven't done it in a long time. So Harry has mentioned, you know, if you do have any questions about mass and balance, ask us, ask any of the instructors and practice it as well. You know, you could do a mass and balance calculation for a flight you're not even going on, just to get that practice back in. So it should be completed before every flight. Aircraft performance is also crucial, you know, not necessarily day to day, but even a space of a few hours, you know, the temperature can change, the pressure can change. And if you are on a short runway, performance calculations are really important. So if you go on a check flight with us at Redhill, it's more than likely that the instructor will check your mass balance and performance calculations before you set off. So obviously, don't wait until the briefing. If you've got any questions, ask them before you get to the briefing or in the briefing as well. Airspace. So yeah, absolutely. As some of you guys have said in the comments, airspace is going to be a massive, massive threat as we go back. You've got a number of things here. Firstly, Redhill is in a congested area of the skies. There's no doubt about that. We've got Gatwick, we've got the London TMA, we've got Heathrow, we've got Biggin Hill, we've got Farnborough, all sorts of airspace around us. And so it's really important that you think about those areas of airspace. You know, where are you going to go? How much clearance have you got to those airspace boundaries? But also, you know, you could be so consumed in the navigation aspect that you neglect the lookout. So in airspace that's busy, you need to make sure you're looking out for other traffic. And so regardless of what you're doing, you need to give suitable emphasis on your lookout. You know, don't neglect that at the expense of something else, because ultimately you could have a PA-28 flying straight towards you. And if you're looking down, writing something or checking the chart or looking at Sky Demon, you know, it's your responsibility to make sure that collisions are avoided. Airspace infringements. So we've got a whole webinar about this next Tuesday. Please come along to that one. It's going to be full of top tips about how to avoid airspace infringements around Redhill and the really busy airspace in the southeast in general. So yeah, webinar next week for that one. Weather, Harry's talked about. Weather's always a threat in flying. It could be too windy. It could be, you know, no wind at all is a threat. You could have cloud visibility issues, precipitation. So before every flight, just check the weather. You know, use the sources available to you. Build up a picture of the weather, and then you can make a judgment. You can make a judgment. Is it safe to fly? Is it legal to fly? Am I happy to fly? A really, really important thing to consider, and it's something that's probably floated to the back of your mind having not flown for a long time, is carb icing. You know, it doesn't have to be icy on the ground outside for carb icing to be a risk. So hopefully a lot of you have seen this graph that's just come up in the top corner. It shows that actually carb icing can happen at really high temperatures. You know, you can look at up to 30 degrees and carb icing is still a problem. So if you haven't seen that diagram before, I urge you, please have a look at CAA Safety Sense 14 leaflet. Even if you have seen it, it's really worth refreshing yourself on the dangers of carb icing and how we can prevent that. So hopefully, you know, you're aware that carb icing checks are really important in the aircraft. And so if you suspect carb icing, then you increase the frequency of the checks. Wet grass is a threat. Someone asked in the comments earlier on if we're on the tarmac or the grass. At the moment, we're on 0725, but we're hoping, we're expecting in the next little while to go back onto the grass. Obviously, if it rains, wet grass is a threat. You know, you've got to think about how's it going to affect my takeoff? How's it going to affect my landing? What procedures do I need to apply when taxiing, for example, on wet grass? So there's all considerations, and that's definitely a threat. And then finally on here, physiological conditions. You're not going to be as used to being thrown around in an aeroplane as you used to be. You know, potentially, you know, you might have hundreds of hours and then get in an aircraft and you suddenly feel sick and you think, gosh, I haven't felt this in a very long time. But it's because your body's not used to it anymore. So take it gently. It sounds stupid, but take a sick bag with you. You know, it's better to have it and not need it than need it and not have it. So find one. You know, you might have one that you stole off a commercial flight a little while ago. Take it with you, and just in case you need it. And if you're doing general handling for a prolonged period of time, take breaks in between. You know, don't throw yourself around the air for an hour. You are going to probably feel a little bit rough after that. So they're all the ones I've identified. Just having a look at the comments then. Yeah, absolutely. Harry mentioned, yeah, ATC opening hours. So yeah, there's a lot of threats to think about when we're going back to flying. But as I said, it's no good just thinking about what threats exist. We've got to think about how we can mitigate against those, so how we can stop those threats from becoming a danger to our flight. So for every threat we come up with, we need to think about how are we going to mitigate against that threat. It's really worth briefing yourself. Now, if you do it on the ground before you go, you could even do it at home in the morning. Or what I like to do is sort of think about it, jot it down on a piece of paper before I even leave for the airplane. And then if I'm taxiing out to the holding point, you know, I can brief myself on any threats I can think of. And it's a really good way of solidifying in your mind the threats that exist and how you're going to deal with those threats. So some examples for you. Busy airspace we've spoken about, you know, thorough lookout, really important. There should be a massive emphasis on looking outside if you're flying VFR, because that's the only thing that's going to stop you from hitting terrain or other aeroplanes. So a lookout is really important. LARS, so Farnborough radar, for example, if you're in their area of coverage, tune them up, you know, talk to them. They're going to be able to build up your picture of the airspace around you. And obviously, if you're on a frequency, you can hear whether it's busy or not. You could hear people's position reports. So in your mind, you can start to make a picture of the airspace that you're in. A threat, low temperature, so mitigation against that. Regular icing checks, increase the frequency of your feeder checks. Variable strong winds is a threat. Consider crosswind limits. There's a difference as well to consider. What's the aircraft limit? What's my limit? And what am I comfortable doing on my first flight back? And they're probably 3 different figures at this point. If the aircraft limit, you're not going to go flying on your first flight back in a 12-knot crosswind, for example. That would be a silly thing to do. So you've got to think about your limit as a student or a PPL holder, and then you might even want to add a buffer to that. If you're not feeling confident in a crosswind landing, don't go flying. Later on, if you've got back to flying and you're feeling confident and you're all checked out again, if there are variable strong winds, just make sure you plan diversion to an airfield with a different runway orientation. It's just that backup in case you can't get back to your original aerodrome. Another threat is an engine failure after takeoff. So how many of you can instinctively now go, right, what am I going to do in case of an engine failure after takeoff? And if the answer is no to that, then you're almost certainly not going to do it correctly if it happened to you on your first flight back. So the mitigation against that is your safety briefing. If you say what you're going to do before you do it, there's a much, much better chance that you'll do it correctly and safely if it did ever happen, God forbid. So when you're at the holding point, if you give your takeoff safety brief and actually talk through what you would do in case of an engine failure after takeoff, it's fresh in your mind. Things you've got to consider: wind direction, where are you going to go, what's the terrain like, are there any buildings, any green areas on the takeoff. So there's things to consider. And finally, I've added in rejected takeoff. So again, it's something that you do need to think about, especially if you're at Redhill on the tarmac runway. You don't have a lot of space, and so if you're on your takeoff roll and the airspeed isn't increasing, then it's really not a good idea or not a safe idea to take that aircraft flying. So you need to put in place in your mind, okay, what's the latest point I can stop while I've got sufficient runway to bring the aircraft to a halt again? So plan that point on the runway, and obviously on your takeoff, you should be doing the takeoff checks anyway. Airspeed alive or airspeed increasing is one of those checks. So we've mentioned coming back to Redhill, there is a requirement for a check flight before you take an aircraft up yourself. Other air clubs may have different rules, but it's really quite worthwhile going up at least for an hour with an instructor, especially if you haven't flown in a very long time. And you've got to think about what's beneficial for you to do on that flight. So I'm just going to run through a few things that we think is probably a good idea to practice on a check flight. And then we will go on to Finn and then the Q&A at the end. So we're nearly there. So obviously you're going to take off, depart, you're going to want to go to an area that's probably quiet and a lot of airspace to work in. So if you're coming from Redhill, probably east towards Tunbridge, Royal Tunbridge Wells, that sort of area. On your way out there, you can think about the local landmarks. If you're on the departure, you can have a look, right, there's Godstone, there's Oxted. Think about where the railway line is, where's South Godstone Station. Remind yourself of what Bow Beach Reservoir looks like. Just have a refamiliarization with the local landmarks. On that as well, you can practice really basic things that you listening to this probably think is trivial, but holding altitude, holding your heading, you're actually probably going to have quite a lot of thought going into that if you haven't done it in a long time. That capacity bucket can really fill up quickly if you're just trying to hold an altitude or hold a heading. Give yourself the extra margin. So if you're going out towards the east from Redhill, you've got the Gatwick airspace. You need to make sure you give yourself a suitable safety buffer so that if you are struggling to hold that altitude, you're not infringing on airspace. You could practice steep turns, so maintaining altitude, give yourself a rollout heading and roll out onto that specified heading. Slow flight, maintaining altitude and balance. You're going to practice some stalls with an instructor. Obviously, you need to start the exercise with the Hazel checks. You can do the clean config stall, so actually let the aircraft stall and do the standard stall recovery. Base to final stall, recovering at the first sign or the incipient symptoms, and a final stall. So get yourself configured as if you were on final and recovery at the first sign of the stall. If you do a practice forced landing, you could either think about it in the air, so you could be 3,000 feet and think, right, if I had an engine failure now, where would I go? What would my considerations be? What actions would I take? You could think about it, or you could actually practice one as well. Just make sure if you are practicing a PFL to consider the 500-foot rule. Obviously, you don't want to go below the legal limit, and also think about doing it in an area with lots of open space so you're not limiting yourself. Practice for the first time, give yourself options. You come back to Redhill or wherever you're flying from and do some circuits. You can do normal, practice a go around, really important. Flapless, if you can, an engine failure after takeoff, and a glide approach. Building back up to the flying skills that you definitely had, especially before the lockdown when you did your PPL as well. So finally from me, these flights are for your benefit. It's not us instructors checking you, it's for you to build up your confidence again to go flying on your own. So you could do it as a 2-hour flight if that's too much. You could do a couple of 1-hour flights with instructors. Not everything that I've just mentioned needs to be demonstrated. It's not a skills test. They're just a guide to think about what would be beneficial to you. Instructors will tailor the flights. If you come in saying, I really want to practice some stalls, then obviously we'll tailor that flight to what you want to do. And as I said, the ultimate aim is not to test you, it's to make you feel comfortable flying as PIC again. If it's been a while, it's going to take more than one attempt to refresh your skills. Don't be disheartened if your steep turn isn't as perfect as you'd like it to be. A couple of practices and you'll be back to the standard you used to be. Another thing worth mentioning is, if you've got a bit of time between now and April, do what's called armchair flying. So sit at home, quite literally in an armchair if you want, and you can just think about the procedures involved in flying again. If you're doing a steep turn, for example, what are you actually going to do? If you're doing a stall, what is the standard stall recovery? So armchair flying is really useful. Some of you in the comments have said you've got flight sim, that sort of thing. Again, you can think about what you would do when you're going back to flying. If you're doing circuits, if in doubt, go around. That's pretty standard. And obviously, if you have any questions or concerns, ask us. We've got the Q&A coming up in just a second, or ask your instructor when you go back. So I'm now going to hand back over to Finn, and thank you very much for listening for that bit.
Dan, Harry, amazing. Yeah, thanks for that. There's some really great tips you cover there. Some of the highlights, I think, for me were when you're talking about writing down threats. I know a lot of the guys in the chats were saying, oh yeah, I'd really actually like to put, when I'm going to put my free to check, write that on my chart when I'm navigating, when I'm flying somewhere. So yeah, some really great stuff there. We're going to take some questions. I've already got a couple of questions written down here from you guys already that I want to answer. And first, I just want to talk about, if you're flying with us at Redhill, some of the things you will have to do when you're flying with us, some of the restrictions. The first two, there's a couple of things to fill in. First is self-declaration form. You're probably quite familiar with this, just saying you haven't got any COVID symptoms. And also there's a back to flying refresher quiz. There's no wrong answers here. You're not graded on it anyway, it doesn't go on your record, but there are wrong answers. It's supposed to start a debate with you and your flight instructor before your flight, and to brush up some of your more technical knowledge. But yeah, if you're in any doubt at all that you might be suffering, or someone you know might have caught COVID, then please just to keep us, our staff, our instructors, our other students and PPL holders safe, just don't bother coming in. We will not care, even if you're cancelling 2-3 minutes before booking's about to start. And also, if you do have that extra stress and pressure on you that maybe you're not sure if you're going to suffer from coronavirus or not, then maybe it's not the right day for you to be flying. Do as much preparation as you can at home. We're trying to avoid having people in the clubhouse as much as possible to keep everyone safe. So pre-flight briefings will be done either via Zoom or pre-recorded videos, or outside if the weather's nice. Obviously, you'll have to wear masks in the aircraft and in the plane. That's CAA guidance. Hand sanitizer when you get in, and keep your social distance, not just from us at Redhill Aviation, but also when you go, say, fuel up at the pumps. Just make sure you keep your distance there. And backup band, same as before, really. The aircraft gets done every 7 days, and before and after every flight, just respray all the sort of real touch points, so controls, keys, etc., etc. So those are some of the things happening at Redhill. Harry popped a few of these places you can get extra information if you want it to. The Skyway Code is an amazing free resource. It's just been updated with all the Brexit stuff on it. So go to the CAA website, download that for free, or some places, if you're an old school person, you can buy the book of that from places like AFE in Manchester. You must shop online with them. Also, I really recommend going to the Redhill Aviation website. If you weren't sure where to get that pre-flight brief that Harry showed you, head to the downloads page. There's some great stuff on there. Same for the airspace safety website. There's lots of stuff on infringements there, and a couple of good things you can print off about frequency monitoring codes, also called listening squawks. And you can also find some other great stuff on there. Shameless plug here. If you want more technical, nerdy GA safety stuff, head to YouTube or follow me on Instagram at FlyWithFinn. Gasco, they've got a great course you can do at the moment that's really geared around human factors and getting people back flying and being aware of human factors. So go do their free online course if you want to. CAA have also got a webinar tomorrow night. We must be the trendsetters. And they've also got a couple of publications about getting back into the air flying. So that's some places you can go for some further reading. If you like what we're doing here, then why don't you come along to some other ones? So, for example, next week, we're going to talk about how to avoid becoming another infringement statistic around Redhill. We already heard from Dan and Harry about how the airspace, and you probably know yourself about how cramped the airspace is. So come listen to our top tips and tricks for not infringing airspace next Tuesday at 6 o'clock. If you're sat here and you're thinking a lot of this may be above me, I'm still only done a few lessons of my PPL, or maybe you're thinking you've got a friend who's studying for their PPL and they'd really benefit from something like this, then we're doing a lesson all about how to succeed straight back in on your first few lessons after lockdown, when it's been a long time since you last learned. So come to that one. That's on April Fool's Day, which is just a coincidence, at 6 p.m. And then we were saying earlier about how we hear from pilots about their radio telephony is sometimes a thing they have the most anxiety about. So if you're sometimes confused or worried about how you come across on the radio, come check out our webinar about how to master every transmission on Tuesday the 6th at 6 p.m. Or even better, come fly with us in real life from the 12th of April. So, time to take your questions. I first wanted to start off with one from Stuart. A bit of a technical one here, Stuart, but I think a lot of people will be asking this. He said something along the lines of, I think you don't need a Class 2 anymore. And yeah, Stuart, you're right. If you've got a UK issued Part FCL license, so an old EASA license that was issued by the UK authorities, not another country, then you don't need a Class 2 anymore, but there are some restrictions. Obviously, if you're going on to do your commercial license, you probably want to stick with a Class 2 or Class 1 anyway, but you can use your PPL as a LAPL. Now, there's some restrictions, such as only 3 passengers, and there's some maximum takeoff mass restrictions, depending which license you've got. But you can just do that with using what's called a pilot's medical declaration, which just means you go to the UK CAA website, tap in a bunch of stuff, apply for it on there, and print out the results of that, bring that with you, and that can suffice instead of a medical. But I really recommend you guys, if you are interested in doing something like that, read through a lot of the restrictions, because you can't take any more than 3 passengers, which probably won't be a problem for most of you, but also you can't do sort of shared introductory flights and cost-sharing flights, which you may want to do with your friends and family. So just be aware of the instructions, but essentially, yes, you don't need that Class 2 medical anymore. You can declare it. If you've got a UK PPL, so the old school ones, not an EASA one, you can, this is moving on a little bit, but I think, Stuart, you might have been asking this question as well. You can fly what we used to call an EASA aircraft, so this kind of Cessnas and PA-28s that we have around at Redhill. You can fly those now. There was a small period in the last year that you couldn't. But there's some restrictions. I'd recommend you head to the CAA website for those restrictions. For example, you can only do 12 hours PIC in them at the moment. But yeah, CAA website is your friend for all those. Go through it with a fine tooth comb, because you can do some of this stuff, but there are some restrictions on it. But thanks for asking that question, Stuart. I hope that answered it. Next up, Peter, you said, do we need to get new charts yet? Great question. The answer is not quite yet, but quite soon. 25th of March, you need a new one by. And in future, if you want to know the date, if you tap into Google UK AIP, head to that website there. There's a VFR charts tab, and that not only tells you which one is current now, so you can check yours is currently current, but also tells you when the next version is out. And also on that same bit of the website, you can subscribe to an amendment service. So when things change before the new chart gets printed, they'll send you information about that. So you can subscribe to that email address there. Ed had a question. I think, Harry, you're going to take Ed's question.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, thanks, Ed. Your question, Ed, was that where can we find the Redhill aircraft POHs, and are there copies to download? The answer to that, Ed, we have copies, hard copies in the aircraft folders at the back, with prompts in there for the mass and balance calculations and performance in there. The weight schedule is along with all the aircraft documents in the folder. If you want to have access to these before you go flying, along with the POH, then the best thing for a POH is to do a generic search online for a Cessna 152 or a Piper Warrior. They're all largely the same to the extent that you will require them from. When it comes to the specific aircraft documents, if there's anything that you really need to see in advance, for example, the weight schedule for mass and balance, then if you haven't already got that on your phone as a photo, give Ops a call. They'll be able to give you the information or send a scan over to you. So hopefully that answers your question there. If not, let us know.
I got a question as well from Andrew about self-hire pilots looking to buddy up. Obviously, we'd love for everyone to find flying companions to go to exciting places with. COVID is obviously restrictions at the moment. Once the restrictions are lifted, we're going to look to do something with our booking system, buddy ups and flyaways as well. So keep an eye on that. And obviously, if you've got any questions, just phone up the club and we'll be able to help you with that one. We've got a licensing question, so I think we're going to go to Finn for that one.
Yeah, there's tons of changes in licensing and understandably a lot of confusion. There's a great question here from Jason, who said he holds an IAA license. That's the Irish Aviation Authority. And I imagine, Jason, you've done that to keep your ability to fly EASA aircraft. The UK CAA have been quite good about this. Until the end of next year, you can fly UK registered aircraft, much as you did before with that license. If you want to take the aircraft outside of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, so that does include if you want to take it to the Channel Islands, then you need to just download a little validation from the CAA website and just take that with you that says this person's fine to fly on this license. The complication, I think, comes when you need to get your SEP rating revalidated. That needs to be done with an instructor who's been approved by the Irish Authority, of which I can say me and Dan aren't yet. Harry, I don't know if you've got anything on this, because I know you swapped your license around as well.
Yeah, I can give a little bit more clarity on this one for you. So Jason, if you or anyone else holds an Irish license, you will need to revalidate at an EASA approved ATO. There is a list of these available on the EASA website. Redhill is not an EASA approved ATO. So as of current, our examiners or instructors, whether they are British licensed or Irish licensed, they are operating under a UK approval. And since we are now no longer part of the EASA system, that means, unfortunately, we cannot do your revalidation at this time. But there are a number of examiners and FIs that do work for third country approved EASA ATOs in the Southeast. If you're unsure, then come and speak to us. We can put you in touch with someone and try and make that a little bit easier for you there.
Thanks, Harry. And that is all the time we've got this session. Thanks to all of you who've come and watched. This is the first time we've done anything like this. So if you've got some feedback, let us know. Pop it either in that chat or send us an email at fly@redhillaviation.co.uk. We love the feedback. If there's something specific you want to talk us to talk about, then let us know. We've got these next 3 more webinars to do. And if this is something that you enjoy, we're looking into the prospect of doing this a bit more after we all get flying again. So if that's something you'd be interested, let us know as well. So thank you all for watching. I really hope that you all get airborne soon so we can go and have a bit more fun in the skies. So yeah, on behalf of me, Dan and Harry, thanks for coming to